Hey guys, I hope you're all still enjoying the conference. My name is Joe Dini. I'm a first-year student at MIT Sloan. Our next presenter's name is Martin Kleinbard, and he'll be presenting Can't Buy Much Love, Why Money is Not Baseball's Most Valuable Currency. This will be a 20-minute talk, and at the end we'll have time for 5 minutes of Q&A. If you can line up in the aisleway for Q&A, that'd be great. Without further ado, help me welcome Martin onto stage.
Thank you so much. Thanks so much for that introduction, Joe, and thanks so much for all of you for coming out and supporting me. So I'm going to start out with a quick question for all of you. Please raise your hand if you agree with the following statement. Not based on what you think I want to hear, but based on your own opinion. Please raise your hand if you agree with this statement. So for those of you who do have your hand raised, and it's not many, you have at least one person who agrees with you. And that would be Baseball Commissioner Bud Selig, who back in 2000 thought that this was an important issue enough that he convened a distinguished group of scholars and public figures that included a college professor, a US senator, the former Fed chairman, and even a journalist who likes to hide behind brick buildings. And together they created the Blue Ribbon Panel Report on Baseball Economics. And the Blue Ribbon Panel's key conclusion, among others, was that baseball's policies meant to reduce the impact of spending on winning have produced neither the intended moderating of payroll disparities nor improved competitive balances. Pretty heavy statement. And some of their recommendations included local revenue sharing of up to 50%, where it was and currently is around only 30%, stripping playoff teams of their first-round picks in the next draft, and even the aggressive relocation of low-market teams. Which brings me to my second question for all of you. Please raise your hand if you, in general, agree with the following statement by the legendary general manager, Branch Rickey. So I certainly agree with this statement as well. And I think that this is good advice for any league to heed. But I would add one important qualifier here, which is that any rule or regulation we're looking at should be minimally invasive. And what I mean by that, it should have as little impact as necessary on the autonomy of teams and on collective bargaining agreement labor peace. Clearly, those solutions posed by the Blue Ribbon Panel were not exactly minimally invasive. The question I'm trying to answer today is, were they or are they still necessary for maintaining parity and competitive balance in baseball? And I'm going to show that the answer eventually is no, they're not necessary. A little overview of what I'm going to talk about today. First, I'm going to introduce this concept of does money buy wins in baseball? Then I'm going to compare baseball to its two main North American competitors, the NBA and the NFL. Then I'm going to compare it to itself throughout its history. And finally, I'm going to conclude with offering my thoughts on the future value of money in baseball. So there were several problems with the Blue Ribbon Report. First, it failed to identify the correct outcome and input metrics. Second, there was a lack of cross-sectional data. And third, there was insufficient longitudinal data. It only looked at a 4-year period. So I'm going to remedy all three of those issues, starting with the most important, which is how do we measure the degree to which money buys wins in baseball? And the metric that I'm going to use to measure that is what I call the win buying index. It's the R squared of a linear regression of standardized wins on standardized payroll expressed in percent form. If that means nothing to you, think about it like this. A win buying index of 25% means that payroll explains 25% of the variation in wins, and the other 75% is due to factors completely unrelated to payroll. Big picture here, higher the win buying index, the more power money has to buy wins. And I should note right now that if at any point you get lost in this session, I have all three of the important metrics I'm talking about today on the back of the piece of paper that I handed you, so you can refer to that at any point. I promise I won't be offended. Okay, next, I have an assumption, and I think you'll grant it to me, that leagues should desire to have a low but non-zero win buying index. And a low win buying index means that the richest teams don't always win. That's good. But it also means that games and seasons are not highly predictable, at least through the lens of payroll, which is also good. So you might be wondering, why don't we just shoot for a win buying index of 0? Okay, I still think it's important that teams with depleted other resources need have at least one vehicle to compete, and I think that that vehicle should be payroll. You might wonder now, well, what influences the win buying index? Well, the Blue Ribbon Report, conventional wisdom would say payroll disparities. The more unequal payrolls are, the more influential money is on winning. So how would we go about measuring this? That brings me to metric number 2, the payroll inequality index. It's, in other words, called the variance coefficient, or the standard deviation of payroll divided by the average payroll. And again, if that doesn't mean anything to you, just think about it like this. The higher the payroll inequality index, the more unequally payrolls are distributed for a given league for a given time period. So we have an outcome metric, we have an input metric. Let's start looking at some data. First, I want to know how powerful is the win buying index in baseball? How does it compare to the NBA and the NFL? And then, are the differences in the win buying indexes between those three leagues, are those caused by differences in payroll inequality or by something else? Quick note about the data. This is from the years 2001 to 2012 for the regular season only. So let's take a look now. And the win buying index is on the left, the payroll inequality index is on the right, and in both cases it goes baseball, then basketball, then football. Well, at first glance, you might be looking at this and saying, looks like the blue ribbon panel was right. Baseball has the highest payroll inequality. It also has the highest win buying index. Seems logical enough that one would cause the other. Looks like payroll inequality leads to greater win buying power. But in the words of one wise man who is sadly not here today, and I think it's important to note that there are several confounding factors that make that last statement I said not actually true. The first is that even for baseball with that 17%, payroll is a terrible predictor of wins. And here's what I mean by that. Let's take the Astros last year. They had a payroll of $22 million. That was the lowest in the league in 5 years. The Yankees had a payroll of $229 million. That was the highest ever. If payroll was even a decent predictor of wins, you would expect the Yankees to be predicted to win a lot more games than the Astros. What actually happened was that using the model of just payroll, there's no statistical difference in the wins projection between those two teams. In fact, the payroll that would have been necessary to predict a team to win more games than the 2013 Astros would have had to have been $413 million, which even for the Yankees is a bit out of their price range. Second, all three of these win buying indexes are very low when we compare to the other major global sports competitor, the English Premier League, which is all the way up at 89%. Now, this is from the book Soccernomics. The authors use a slightly different time period, a slightly different methodology, but there have been various studies of this win buying index concept in EPL, and they've all been between 70 and 90%, so dwarfing the differences in baseball, basketball, and football. And compared to that, those differences look pretty trivial. But you could say to me, I get those 2 points, Martin, but yet, nonetheless, basketball and football have lower payroll inequality, and they have lower win buying indexes, and I think that A causes B, so I still think you're wrong. But if that were true, then in the NBA and the NFL, within each season, we should see positive, strong correlation between the win buying index and the payroll inequality index. But we actually see a negative correlation in both cases. Now, small data sample, just 30 teams each year or 32, I understand that we have a lot of noise. Nonetheless, we can't definitively prove because of this that payroll inequality is what's causing the differences in the win buying index. Well, if not payroll inequality, what is? Well, I'm going to posit that the answer is actually season length, especially in the NFL. Short season, 16 games, a lot of luck can play a part no matter what, and that would manifest itself in a low win buying index. And there's actually corroborating evidence from a paper recently written by Michael Lopez that was on the Sloan blog a few weeks ago, and he essentially finds that if baseball played a 16-game season, there would be more parity than in the NFL. So season length is the real driver, not payroll inequality. Okay, switching gears, baseball throughout its history. Where are we now compared to the other times in history? What impact has the modern era had on the win buying index? And what factors cause those changes over time? Data. Really important to note that we have full payroll data for every year since '77, free agency. But before that, very spotty. So whenever you hear me talking about the pre-free agency era, the reserve clause era, I boil it all down to the following years you see right there. Within the free agency era, I'm going to look at 6-year periods for 2 reasons. One, larger sample size, 180 seasons rather than just 30. And second, it divides nicely between important changes in the collective bargaining agreement. So here we go. Payroll inequality index is red. Win buying index is blue. And the first thing I want you to be looking at here is just look at the changes in the win buying index over time. It's like a roller coaster. It's been varying a lot over time, and it's been declining a lot since the late 1990s. Now, let's step back for a second, and let's compare the reserve clause era to the modern era. Which one conceivably should lead to a lower win buying index? Well, in the reserve clause era, you had what you could call a free market for rookies because there was no draft, so the Yankees could just buy all the best amateur talent. So that should cause the win buying index to go up. But at the other hand, you didn't have free agency, no free market for veterans, so that means the best players weren't paid much more than the worst. That means the win buying index should go down. It's the exact opposite for the modern era. We have a draft, so there's no free market for rookies. That should cause the win buying index to go down. But we have free agency, So that should allow teams to buy the best veterans, and so that should allow the win buying index to go up. Well, problem is we have up and down arrows in both directions, so we have an ambiguous theoretical effect of the modern era on win buying index. We're going to have to rely on the empirical data to tell us which factor matters more, a free market for rookies or a free market for veterans. And the data is unequivocal. The reserve clause era win buying index, 40%, modern era, just 16%. Key takeaway, rookie acquisition, far more important than veteran retention in maintaining a low win buying index. In other words, the modern era has benefited low payroll teams because even though the advent of free agency has hurt them, the presence of the draft has helped them much more than free agency hurt them. Now, let's take a look at the relationship between payroll inequality and the win buying index. And you can see from 78 to 95, perfect positive correlation, almost. And that's exactly what the blue ribbon panel would have you believe is the way things work. But now we have this bizarre shift to a negative correlation where we have payroll inequality going up and win buying index going down. In other words, payroll inequality no longer predicts the win buying index. Well, if payroll inequality can't predict the win buying index, what factor can? I'm going to rely on the words of another wise man to help us out. So for those of you sad enough to not know this reference, we're talking about youths or young players. So there are several benefits, as many of you know, to having young players in baseball. Teams have control over them for their first 6 seasons at below market salaries. And then after 6 seasons, the players become free agents and can sign with anyone for any amount. So the relevant question here is how good are young players relative to veterans? And from now on, when I say young, I'm talking about pre-free agency eligible players, regardless of how actually old they are. And that brings us to our third metric, the Youth Dominance Index. It's the percent of all Cy Young or MVP caliber seasons produced by young players. In other words, the higher the Youth Dominance Index, the higher the returns are to youth. Again, pre-free agency players. So let's take a look and compare the Youth Dominance Index to the Win Buying Index. And what we see is a consistently very strong negative correlation that has only gotten stronger over time to a perfect -1 since 1996. Now, intuitively, this makes sense. Because as young players become more dominant, that means veteran players are becoming less dominant. That means the value of a dollar to buy a free agent goes down, and that should cause the win buying index to go down. But the degree to the strength of it is pretty shocking. Key takeaway is that youth dominance is the predictor of the ability to buy wins, not payroll inequality. So that's what the league should be looking at when it wants to determine how much inequality, parity is there going to be in future years. Now, wrapping it all up, let's compare all 3 of these metrics on one graph, normed to the 96 to 01 levels. And as we've talked about, Youth Dominance Index has been skyrocketing. It's been causing Win Buying Index to plummet. And the Payroll Inequality Index has risen and then kind of flatlined. So putting it all together, let's compare the blue ribbon conventional wisdom theory about how economics works in baseball to what we now know is the reality post-2002. According to theory, the Payroll Inequality Index is going to go up. That's going to cause the win buying index to go up as well, and the youth dominance index really just doesn't matter. What we now know to be true is that the youth dominance index goes up, that causes the win buying index to go down, and then the jury is out for the payroll inequality index. We don't know what the causality is. We don't know which dog is wagging which tail, because it could be that teams are spending more money just because they have more money now. It could be that other teams are spending less because they realize at this point. It could be something completely spurious that I have no idea about. But what we do know is we have this complete juxtaposition of more money chasing less free agent talent, and we have a lot of really underpaid players, young players playing really well, and we have a lot of really overpaid players, old players who are not being paid, who are paid well but not playing well. And that manifests itself in what you could see as the most underpaid players of the last 12 years, comparing a player's salary to their approximate dollar value according to Fangraphs. And of these players from the past 12 years, 8 of them were in the past 3 seasons, and 5 of them were in 2013 alone. And yes, Mike Trout is very good. Even at $1 million this year, he's still a pretty decent deal. So huge concentration recently of underpaid players. Same for overpaid players, even more drastic. 9 of the top 10 from just the past 3 seasons, 5 just last year. And Vernon Wells really should get his agent a good present, because he also has number 13 on this list as well. Now, to conclude, in case you were sleeping for the last 20 minutes, key points: baseball, basketball, football. Payroll has a minimal explanatory value on winning for all 3, but positive and statistically significant, I should say that, but they all pale in comparison to the EPL. Season length, not payroll inequality, may explain the differences in the win buying index. looking just at the lens of baseball, the modern era has benefited low payroll teams because the draft has helped them more than free agency has hurt them. And youth dominance explains the low win-buying index, not the disparity of payroll. This paper does have several limitations, and I want to make you aware of them before you go running off and tweeting my conclusions willy-nilly, which of course you're all going to do. First, this applies to the regular season only, so you can't determine like who's going to win in the playoffs. If you don't get this, then go back and read Moneyball. Okay, number two, data team agnostic. So we don't know which teams are better at buying wins than the others. We don't know if that's true. The problem is because if you wanted to look at that, you had such a small sample size with just one team, it probably wouldn't be very easy to do. Second, this is not a study of parity third, it's not the study of parity for its own sake. It doesn't punish a league with low payroll dynasties. That looks good from the sense of win-buying index, but it doesn't look good from the sense of just general parity, and it should be remedied through other channels not mentioned in this paper. And most importantly, this is not a marginal analysis. This can't tell you how much money you're going to have to spend on average to win your 90th game if you're projected to win 89 games. But there's a lot of great work from people from Baseball Prospectus, Fangraphs, et cetera, who have answered that question if that's what you're interested in. Now, in case I ever got to run the world of baseball for one day, here are my recommendations. Again, minimally invasive measures to ensure a low payroll winning relationship. The analogy I like to use is we want to be fixing broken windows here, not buying a whole new car. My analysis has shown we don't need to buy a whole new car. And my recommendations are fairly obvious. Include international players in the draft. It's just not fair that some teams can buy the services of the best international players. Strict cap on draft slot signing bonuses. You can't have a low payroll team being afraid to draft a player because they can't give them a high enough bonus. And third, we need to revert to the old free agent compensation system, which, although flawed, was more fair to the low payroll teams. Because now, if a team can't afford to make that $14 million qualifying offer, they lose the player and the pick. Now, predictions. Nobody can make predictions. Whatever is on the slide is wrong, but I got a minute left, so I'm going to do it anyway. Question, will baseball's low win-buying index days continue? The real question that we want to know is, will the high youth dominance index days continue? And there are arguments you could make in both directions. To say yes, you could argue that, well, there's better coaching and training of young athletes, and that's going to cause the pro-ready age to continue to decline. On the side of no, you could say advances in medical science will allow older players to continue to stay dominant into their 30s and even 40s. From a cynical, but perhaps realistic perspective, I think the tiebreaker might be baseball's future PED policies. If you grant me the assumption that PEDs give more benefit to older players, which I think is a fair assumption, then it's just logical. As PED testing and penalties go up, the relative performance of free agency eligible players will go down, and therefore the youth dominance index days, the high youth dominance index days will stay high, and the win-buying index will continue to stay low. I'm going to end with looking at the youth dominance index graph and wonder if that was staring us in the face the entire time. That should be like the 96 to 01 season. Don't know what happened there. But you get the idea. Between 96 and 01, we see by far the lowest period of youth dominance index on record, or conversely, the highest period of veteran dominance index on record. What was going on in 96 to 01? Most people think that's when steroids were a bigger deal in baseball. So is this a coincidence or not? I'll let you decide that. However, I will say that this data and this paper show one key conclusion, that steroid testing, on top of the moral issues and on top of the safety issues, can have a parity component too. So the more steroid testing we have, the more inherent parity we're going to have through the lens of payroll. Thank you all so much for your time. I know you have a choice on where you fly, and I appreciate you flying with me. Thank you.
All right, we have a few minutes for Q&A. If you have a question, please step forward in the aisle.
And while you do that, I will give you the answers to the trivia questions. Do you know the answer to this question?
No.
Anybody know? Anybody? Just say it out loud. What is it? Biggio. Craig Biggio, who missed the Hall of Fame by 2 votes this year, sadly. Anyway, what's your question?
All right, great job.
Thanks.
I just had a question maybe about adjusting for injuries. So
Sure.
You used the example of last year's Yankees.
Yeah.
And I know this might be difficult to do, but a lot of their payroll wasn't playing. Is there any good way to adjust for that?
I'm not sure you want to adjust for that. I think that's part of the whole point,
Okay.
is that there's just all this randomness and luck that goes into it.
Okay.
And that's another thing I didn't bring up, but did in the paper, that I think luck plays more of a factor, injuries also play more of a factor in the NBA and NFL. Not that they don't matter in baseball. So that also caused the win buying index to go down.
I guess with the Yankees though, it's such a huge amount of dollars, right? Is that I guess with the bigger teams that might skew the dollar amount, is that something that worth looking into?
Do you think that the Yankees inherently get players who are more injury prone? Maybe that, but I would think they would be pretty evenly distributed. Okay. But I don't know, honestly. Right. Thank you, though.
All right, any more questions?
So
hold on, do you know the answer to the second question?
Oakland A's and...
No, read it closely. It says basketball.
Oh,
come
basketball?
on, fail.
No, then I have no idea.
Anybody? Shane Battier and what team? Rockets. That's correct. Okay.
Oh.
Go on, Zach.
So the early part of the analysis talked a little bit about the difference in leagues, MLB, NBA, and NFL. Do you have any sense for the impact of the salary cap between, obviously, NBA and NFL have a cap, MLB doesn't? Is there anything that you've thought about or would have a perspective on the differences?
Two things. First, I would have loved to have gotten the pre and post payroll data and being able to run this for pre and post salary cap for the NBA and the NFL. I couldn't find it anywhere. Payroll data is really hard to find pre-2001 for every sport except for baseball. That would be really interesting, because that could really do a better job of explaining the causality than the correlation I showed you. That being said, the salary cap is all woven into the win buying index. So like, if there's a salary cap, that's going to have a lower payroll inequality index. So it's all woven into the payroll inequality index already. So I think that it kind of 6 of one, half dozen of the other.
Any more questions?
Okay, last one. Anyone know the answer to this one? Kubiak. That is correct. All right, thank you so much. Really appreciate it.